The Russian forces managed to gain full control over the settlement of Kupiansk and push into Myrnohrad from the eastern direction. With this, the battle over Myrnohrad has begun. The Russians, following an initial push towards Balahan in the north, followed it up with an additional push from the east. The Russians over the past few months have been fighting over the fortifications to the east of Myrnohrad and have now captured everything to the east of the city itself on the eastern flank of the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth lines. With this, the Russians have managed to secure the eastern flank and for them a flank for their forces to push in the southern direction alongside the fortifications that are keeping them out of Myrnohrad. This allowed them to push down towards the settlement here on the eastern flank of Myrnohrad, and with the capture of the fortifications on the northern flank of Rodivka, the Russians now have several supply lines that lead to the front line near Myrnohrad. The Russians can supply through Rodivka towards Promin, and following that up with Myrnohrad, and to the north to connect to Mirolivka and Mykolaiivka along the western bank of the Kazani-Torets river line. That is besides the intersection highway that connects towards Novoekonomichny. Through this, the Russians are able to divert their forces alongside the defensive lines, and with this, the Russians are bypassing the fortifications, and they found a gap in the defenses of the Ukrainians by pushing into Kupiansk, where they can establish positions and build up their forces within the basements of the buildings within the settlement, allowing them to grow their forces in the area for additional pushes towards Myrnohrad. The Russians are going directly for the middle part to isolate the northern and southern parts of Myrnohrad from each other. They're currently connected through this tight gap where the apartment complex buildings is keeping the area safe and overlooks the eastern and western flanks of Myrnohrad. The Russian push towards the central parts has an objective of cutting off the northern and southern parts from each other, which would require the capture of the apartment complex area. This means that the Russians might be pushing directly towards that apartment complex area to take up positions within it prior to the Ukrainians putting up positions themselves. What we do know is that the Ukrainians have a significant concentration of forces within Pokrossk and Myrnohrad to defend the cities and launch counterattacks. However, the positions of those forces is the question that isn't answered. We see that the Ukrainians have several apartment complex buildings in the southern parts and eastern parts, including an industrial area, which are well defendable by the Ukrainians, so they likely have some garrisons within them. As for the apartment complex area, it is a possibility that the Ukrainians have a significant garrison within it, but it is also possible that they are spread out across the city and not concentrated. Therefore, if the Russians are able to quickly push towards it, it'll face less resistance than if the fight drags on and the Ukrainians are able to properly put up their defenses in the area. If the Russians are able to push directly towards it, then they can cut the city into two, and it'll be difficult for the Ukrainians to defend the southern parts of it. Gaining control over the southern parts of Myrnohrad is a game changer for this section of the front line, as it will allow the Russians to connect their forces between the eastern and western parts in the southern flank of Pokrossk to secure the railway area, to secure additional highways leading into Pokrossk from the south, and the railway leading into Myrnohrad. This will give the Russians several additional supply lines leading into both of these cities. In either case, it is clear that the Russian objective here is to push towards the apartment complex area and establish a foothold within the city, to then consolidate the positions on the eastern flank to gain control over Promin, as well as the fortifications outside the Dragon Teeth and anti-tank ditches, before pushing into the city itself from the railway to the south and from the road connected to Rodivka in the east. This will allow the Russians to have several supply lines leading into Myrnohrad for their push towards the city and the storming of it. It is unlikely that the Russians will be pushing in the northern parts of Minurat until they have stabilized the situation in the south, as they'll be spreading their forces in several directions. However, if they also push into the northern part, it'll be from the northern flank to divert the Ukrainian forces into the southern and northern directions for a push towards the central parts to cut off the connection in between the northern and southern groupings. Meanwhile, it has been reported by Russian sources that the Russians have started storming the apartment complex area in the central parts of Pokrossk. So fighting has started in the central apartment complex area, and over the northwestern outskirts of the Shakhtarski district. The Russians are looking to gain control over the remaining parts of these connected apartment buildings, which will lead to a solid Russian control over everything south of the railway line going through the central parts of the city. And while the Russians are already storming the industrial area in the western outskirts to cut off the E50 highway, the Ukrainian positions that remains will be centered around the industrial area to the northeastern outskirts of Pokrossk, while the Russians will then be able to direct their forces from Pokrossk to the flank of Myrnohrad, which is why the apartment complex area is so important. It does not just cover the eastern flank, but it also covers the western flank. To the north of Pokrossk, fighting continues on the eastern flank of Shakhove, where the Russians have managed to gain control over the roads leading into Shakhove from the eastern flank along the first lines in the area, gaining control over the first lines here east of the Kazani-Terets river line, and reaching the outskirts of Shakhove, where to the northwest, one of the supply lines leading into the settlement has been cut off by the Russian forces. The second road is connected through the northeast. This means if the Russians continue advancing along the Kazani-Terets river line, getting control over the residential area here on the eastern bank of the river line, isolated from the main parts of the town, the Russians would be able to gain physical control over all of the roads leading into Shakhove, where the Ukrainians would have to resupply through the first lines and fields in the northern flank of the town with no paved roads. And now in the middle of October, that is a difficult way to supply their forces because the rainy season has begun, which complicates the supply over fields, as fields can turn into muddy roads very quickly, getting the vehicles stuck. Therefore, areas where a lot of supplies have to go through, paved roads are needed. Russians are now just a few hundred meters from gaining control over the last intersection just outside of Shakhove, which will cut off all paved roads leading into the town and complicating the supplies of their forces. While there is already this bridge crossing, which at this point likely has been struck by the Russian forces, unless they plan on using it themselves. In either case, the supplies have already been complicated by the Russians gaining control over the intersection to the northwest. A physical capture of the intersection to the northeast will further complicate the supplies leading into the town. Moving on to the northern section of the front line in the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians have managed to start storming the apartment complex building and capture the first few buildings here in the southern parts of the city. With this, Russians are storming one of the final outposts of Ukrainian defensive positions within the city. Getting control over the school area in the eastern outskirts is the final position, besides that of what remains of the apartment complex area in the southern outskirts. And with this, it is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control over Kupiansk. The Ukrainians are on their last positions on the outskirts of the city, following which they will have nowhere to go but regular residential buildings, which are vulnerable to artillery fire and FPV drone strikes, which makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to hold what remains of it. Following this, the Russians will be pushing down south towards Shakhove. Gaining control over Shakhove would be their goal, following Kupiansk to gain control over any crossing across the Osk river line for the Ukrainian forces here to the east of Kupiansk, which will then allow the Russians to physically encircle a significant portion of Ukrainian forces operating here in the Kupiansk section of the front line and solidify the Russian hold over this section of the front line. This is a disaster for the Ukrainians if they have not yet started withdrawing their forces across the Osk river line. Otherwise, a significant portion of their forces can be encircled. There are several fortified positions on the eastern parts of the Osk river line where the Ukrainians can operate, and it would have been very difficult for the Russians to capture these positions, including many areas with massive apartment complex buildings and several defensive lines, all of which can be encircled by the Russian forces following the capture of Kupiansk, which will much quicker and without losses gain control over a significant portion of the front line, which spans approximately 200 square kilometers and has several mechanized brigades operating in the area, which means if they are encircled, they will also be losing armored vehicles and tanks. Further to the north in the Sumi region, the Ukrainians managed to push into Alexivka both from the western and southern directions, reaching into the central parts of the settlement gain control over the southern roads and the farm area on the western outskirts of it. With this, the Ukrainians have entered Oleksivka following weeks of fighting on the outskirts and months of fighting on the flanks. The Ukrainians have been working on pressuring the supply lines leading into the town from Novomykolaiivka and from the northern flank, where the northern one has already been cut off by the Ukrainians having fire control over it, while the eastern road has been threatened multiple times with Ukrainian captures of Vereshchina and pushes in that direction to cut off the supplies going through Novomykolaiivka towards Oleksivka. However, constant Russian counterattacks have regained control over Vereshchina several times, and they're currently the ones holding it, securing the road towards Novomykolaiivka, from which they can redirect forces from the recently captured Vereshchina towards Oleksivka. So we're seeing a lot of back and forth here. Whether the Ukrainians will be able to capture the town or not, it is a result of months of fighting. It has been your host, Weeb Union. Thank you for watching and have a great day.